Before the grand empires and the epic clashes, the lands that would one day be called Persia were, well, just lands. Picture a vast, rugged plateau nestled between the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south, bordered by towering mountains and arid deserts. This wasn't some empty wilderness, though. For millennia, various tribes and peoples had carved out existences here, eking out a living from the often unforgiving landscape. We're talking about folks who built their mud brick homes, tended their flocks, and probably grumbled about the weather, much like we do today, just without the benefit of a central heating system. They were the Elamites, the Medes, the Parthians, names that might sound like characters from a very niche fantasy novel, but who were in fact the original inhabitants, laying down the cultural and linguistic bedrock upon which the later empires would rise. These early inhabitants weren't exactly waiting around for a unified Persian identity to drop from the sky. They were a mix of settled agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the availability of water. Imagine small, self-sufficient communities, occasionally trading with their neighbors, perhaps sometimes squabbling over grazing rights, much like a particularly intense neighborhood watch meeting. Their early settlements, like Susa in the southwestern part of what is now Iran, date back thousands of years, showcasing remarkable advancements in pottery, metallurgy, and even early forms of writing. It's a bit like finding ancient prototypes of your favorite gadgets, functional, perhaps a little clunky, but undeniably innovative for their time. These were the proto-urban centers, buzzing with life, even if their downtown area was mostly just a really big marketplace. One of the more fascinating, if slightly fringe, tidbits from this era concerns the Qanats, an ancient Persian system of underground aqueducts. These ingenious tunnels, often stretching for miles, tapped into groundwater sources in the mountains and channeled water to thirsty agricultural lands and settlements in the arid plains. It's truly a marvel of ancient engineering, built long before anything resembling modern surveying equipment, and it allowed for the flourishing of communities in places that would otherwise be barren. Think of it as the world's first large-scale, self-sustaining irrigation system, making the desert bloom, or at least making it slightly less sandy. Historians still argue whether the concept of the Qanat originated independently in Persia or if it was influenced by earlier technologies from neighboring regions. It's one of those ancient chicken or egg scenarios that keeps scholars happily debating over old maps and archaeological digs. The Medes, a powerful Indo-Iranian people, eventually emerged as a dominant force in the western part of the Iranian plateau. They established their own kingdom, with Ecbatana as its capital, a city whose grandeur was legendary even in antiquity, though not much remains of it today. The Medes weren't just a powerful military force, they were also culturally significant, influencing the development of early Persian art, architecture, and even some religious practices. They were, in many ways, the cool older siblings of the Persians, showing them the ropes of empire building, albeit on a slightly smaller scale. Their ascendancy marked a crucial step towards a more unified regional power, setting the stage for something even bigger, something that would eventually eclipse their own achievements. This wasn't just a loose collection of tribes anymore. It was starting to look like an organized political entity with all the accompanying complexities, power struggles, and presumably the occasional bureaucratic headache. The stage was being set for a very particular family to make a very big splash. From the foundations laid by those early peoples and the budding power of the Medes, a figure emerged who would forever change the trajectory of this part of the world. Imagine a young man, sharp as a tack, with a vision far grander than any local chieftain. This was Cyrus the Great, and he wasn't just building a kingdom, he was building an empire, one that would make the Medes look like a particularly well-organized book club. His rise wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like a carefully orchestrated crescendo. He began as a vassal ruler of Anshan, a small kingdom within the larger Median Empire. Think of it like a duke within a duchy, but a duke with a serious ambition problem in the best possible way. Cyrus's genius lay not just in his military prowess, though he certainly had that in spades, but in his revolutionary approach to conquest. Unlike many conquerors who arrived with fire and brimstone, Cyrus preferred a lighter touch. When he eventually turned on his Median overlord, Astyages, and captured Ecbatana around 550 BCE, he didn't sack the city or enslave its people. Instead, he absorbed the Median aristocracy into his own, maintaining much of their administrative structure. It was a remarkably shrewd move, like taking over a rival company and immediately promoting their best employees, ensuring a smooth transition and minimizing resentment. This policy of tolerance and integration would become a hallmark of his reign and a key to the rapid expansion of his empire. Historians still argue whether Cyrus's benevolence was a genuine philosophical stance or a highly effective pragmatic strategy. Perhaps it was a delightful blend of both, a bit like a well-executed magic trick, impressive no matter how you look at it. His next major target was the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Asia Minor, ruled by the legendary King Croesus, who was so rich he probably had gold-plated everything, including his toothbrush. Croesus, feeling pretty confident about an oracle's prophecy that a great empire would fall if he attacked Cyrus, decided to test his luck. Spoiler alert, the great empire that fell was his own. Cyrus, with his swift and decisive campaigns, captured Sardis, the Lydian capital, around 547 BCE. What's quirky here is the story that Cyrus, upon capturing Croesus, spared his life and even consulted him on matters of state. It's a nice story, almost too nice, but it fits the pattern of his calculated magnanimity. Imagine your conqueror asking for investment advice, a truly unique approach to regime change. But the biggest prize, the one that cemented his reputation, was Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, with its hanging gardens and colossal walls, was considered impregnable. Its king, Nabonidus, was more interested in archaeology and moon worship than ruling, which apparently didn't sit well with the priests of Marduk, the city's patron god. This internal strife played right into Cyrus's hands. In 539 BCE, his forces, led by his general Gobryas, entered Babylon almost without a fight, famously diverting the Euphrates River to enter through its dried riverbed, though this detail is still debated. Cyrus then issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with an account of his conquest, and more importantly, his policy of allowing deported peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This act, described in the Bible, earned him a unique place in history and religious texts as a liberator. The sheer scale of what Cyrus achieved is mind-boggling. He created the Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. He wasn't just conquering lands, he was building a cohesive, multi-ethnic state held together by a surprisingly light touch, tolerance, and efficient administration. He established a system of satrapies, provinces governed by appointed officials, allowing for localized rule within a centralized framework. It was an early form of federalism, long before anyone used that word, and it worked remarkably well. Cyrus understood that you could catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, especially when those flies represented entire nations with their own cultures and gods. His reign was a testament to the idea that power didn't always have to be brutal to be effective. Sometimes, a bit of understanding and a promise of stability went a very long way indeed. With Cyrus the Great having laid the foundations of an empire that stretched further than anyone could have imagined, the stage was set for his successor to step into some seriously big sandals. Enter Cambyses II, Cyrus's son, who inherited an empire of unprecedented scale and an even more unprecedented challenge, living up to his legendary father. Now imagine being the kid of a rock star. Everyone expects you to be equally awesome, and anything less feels like a letdown. Cambyses certainly had the ambition, but perhaps not quite the same diplomatic finesse as his dad. His most notable achievement, and indeed the focal point of his reign, was the conquest of Egypt. Egypt, with its ancient pharaohs, its mighty Nile, and its formidable deserts, had always been a glittering prize, a land of immense wealth and strategic importance. For centuries, it had largely remained independent of the Mesopotamian powers. But Cambyses saw it as the logical next step in expanding the Achaemenid realm. In 525 BCE, he launched his campaign. The decisive battle took place at Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. The story goes, and this is where it gets quirky, that Cambyses used cats, sacred to the Egyptians, as a psychological weapon, painting them on his soldiers' shields, or even leading them into battle. The Egyptians, fearing to harm the revered felines, supposedly hesitated, leading to their defeat. While it makes for a fantastic tale, most modern historians dismiss it as a later Greek embellishment, a bit of ancient propaganda designed to make the Persians seem cunning and the Egyptians hopelessly superstitious. Still, it highlights the cultural clash that was at play. The conquest of Egypt wasn't just a military victory, it was a cultural absorption. Cambyses adopted the title of pharaoh and even paid homage to Egyptian deities, a continuation of his father's policy of respecting local traditions. He aimed to present himself as a legitimate ruler, not just a foreign invader, though his actions were often seen through a different lens by the Egyptians themselves. However, his reign in Egypt was marked by reports, mostly from the Greek historian Herodotus, of his increasingly erratic behavior. Stories circulated of him desecrating temples, mocking religious rites, and even ordering the secret murder of his own sister wife, a truly disturbing family affair. Historians still argue whether these accounts are accurate portrayals of a mad king or simply biased Greek propaganda designed to demonize the Persian conqueror. It's difficult to separate fact from dramatic fiction when the primary sources have a clear agenda, much like trying to figure out what really happened in a reality TV show. While Cambyses was busy solidifying his rule in Egypt, trouble brewed back home. A Magian priest named Gaumata, possibly an impostor claiming to be Cambyses's supposedly murdered brother Bardia, seized the Persian throne. This news spurred Cambyses to leave Egypt and march back to Persia. However, his return journey was cut short. He died in Syria under mysterious circumstances, either by an accidental self-inflicted wound from his own sword or, less heroically, from an illness. His death in 522 BCE plunged the empire into a brief but intense period of instability. So, Cambyses's legacy is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, he successfully expanded the empire by adding the venerable civilization of Egypt, a feat that eluded many before him. On the other hand, his reign was short, turbulent, and marred by allegations of tyrannical behavior and a suspicious death. He certainly didn't have the golden touch of his father, but he kept the imperial machine rolling, albeit with a few more bumps in the road. His sudden demise left a gaping power vacuum, setting the stage for a dramatic power struggle that would test the very fabric of the young Achaemenid Empire and introduce yet another pivotal figure onto the grand historical stage. The empire was enormous, but its stability, it turned out, was still very much a work in progress. The sudden, rather dramatic exit of Cambyses II from the historical stage left the nascent Persian Empire in a precarious spot. Imagine a huge, freshly built house, but the architect suddenly vanishes and a squatter claims ownership. That's essentially what happened with Gaumata, the Magian priest who seized the throne, claiming to be the late Bardia, Cambyses's brother. This was a crisis of legitimacy, a real who's in charge here moment for an empire that was barely a few decades old. But from this chaos, a new figure, perhaps the most pivotal of them all in terms of organizing and solidifying the empire, would rise. His name was Darius I, and he was about to prove that good administration could be just as impactful as grand conquest. Darius was not a direct descendant of Cyrus the Great, but rather a distant cousin from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid royal family. He was part of the Persian elite, a shrewd military commander and a political operator par excellence. He wasn't about to let an impostor, real or perceived, sit on the throne. Along with 6 other Persian nobles, he orchestrated a swift coup, assassinating Gaumata in 522 BCE. The story, recounted in his own words on the Behistun inscription, is a tale of daring and conviction, though one can't help but wonder about the precise details of that fateful day. Historians still argue whether Gaumata truly was an impostor or if Darius simply fabricated the story to justify his usurpation of the throne. It's one of those tantalizing historical puzzles, like trying to figure out if your friend really saw a UFO or just had a particularly strong cup of coffee. Once Darius had secured the throne, he faced an empire in rebellion. Many provinces, seeing the central authority weakened, decided it was a prime opportunity to declare independence. It was a true test of leadership, like trying to herd 1,000 very stubborn cats, all heading in different directions. Darius spent the first few years of his reign relentlessly crushing these revolts, province by province, reasserting Achaemenid authority with a firm hand. He wasn't afraid to be tough, but he also understood the art of governance. And this is where Darius truly shone. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was the great organizer. He took Cyrus's broad vision and refined it into a sophisticated, highly efficient administrative machine. He divided the vast empire into about 20 satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap, a loyal governor often drawn from the Persian nobility. To prevent these satraps from becoming too powerful, Darius implemented a clever system of checks and balances. Each satrapy also had a military commander reporting directly to the king, and a royal secretary who kept tabs on the satrap's activities. Then, there were the king's eyes and ears, royal inspectors who periodically traveled throughout the empire, reporting directly to Darius on the state of affairs in each province. It was an early form of accountability, a bit like a medieval version of corporate oversight, ensuring no one got too comfortable or too ambitious. One of his most impressive feats was the creation of a standardized monetary system, introducing a uniform gold coin called the daric. This standardized currency facilitated trade across the vast empire, making economic transactions smoother and more efficient. Imagine going from a barter system where you traded your chickens for someone else's pottery to having a universally accepted currency. It was a game changer for commerce, boosting the empire's wealth and connectivity. He also standardized weights and measures, further streamlining economic activity. Beyond administration, Darius was also a monumental builder. He initiated ambitious construction projects, most notably the magnificent new capital city of Persepolis. This wasn't just a city, it was a grand ceremonial complex, a testament to the power and glory of the Achaemenid Empire. Its elaborate palaces, audience halls, and intricate carvings depicted tribute-bearers from every corner of the empire, a visual representation of the vastness and unity of the Persian realm. It was a place designed to impress, to awe, and to subtly remind everyone just who was in charge. He also built the Royal Road, an incredible network of roads stretching over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, complete with rest stops and postal stations. This superhighway of antiquity allowed for rapid communication and troop movement, truly shrinking the enormous distances within the empire. If you needed a message to get from one end of the empire to the other, it could travel faster than ever before. It was like ancient high-speed internet, but with more horses and less buffering. Darius's reign marked the zenith of the Achaemenid Empire's internal stability and organizational prowess. He not only restored order, but elevated the empire to new heights of administrative sophistication and economic prosperity. He proved that an empire could be vast and well managed, a testament to his foresight and strategic brilliance. His policies created a period of relative peace and prosperity, setting the stage for future interactions with the wider world, particularly with those pesky city-states across the Aegean Sea that were about to cause a bit of a headache. Having established an empire of unparalleled size and administrative efficiency under Darius I, Persia now looked outward. It had consolidated its vast holdings, from Egypt in the west to the borders of India in the east, and life within its borders was, for the most part, stable and prosperous. But empires, especially ones that see themselves as the benevolent overlords of the known world, tend to bump up against other, smaller, less amenable entities. And so, the narrative takes a turn from internal organization to external confrontation, leading us directly to the famed Persian Wars, a series of conflicts that would pit the mighty Persian Empire against a collection of fiercely independent city-states in a relatively small corner of the world, Greece. The initial sparks of conflict weren't accidental. The Persian Empire, having absorbed Lydia, now controlled the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, known as Ionia. These Ionian Greeks, though nominally part of the empire, chafed under Persian rule. They were used to their own forms of self-governance, their own squabbles, and their own peculiar ways of doing things, which didn't always align with the dictates of a distant imperial satrap. Think of it like a group of fiercely independent artists suddenly having to report to a corporate CEO. There's bound to be some friction. In 499 BCE, the Ionian cities revolted, seeking help from their kin across the Aegean. Athens, a rising power among the Greek city-states, and Eretria, a smaller but similarly independent-minded city, sent ships and troops to aid the rebels. This act of defiance, this support for rebellion within Persian territory, was seen by Darius as a direct challenge, an insult that simply could not be ignored. Darius, remember him, the meticulous organizer? He wasn't one to let a slight go unpunished. The Ionian revolt was eventually put down, but the role of Athens and Eretria was not forgotten. Darius saw it not just as a regional uprising, but as a precursor to larger interference, a potential threat to the stability of his vast empire. He aimed to teach the mainland Greeks a lesson, to show them the consequences of meddling in Persian affairs, and to bring them, somewhat reluctantly, into the imperial fold. This wasn't necessarily about territorial expansion, as much as it was about reasserting Persian authority and projecting imperial power. The first Persian punitive expedition against mainland Greece occurred in 492 BCE, led by Darius's son-in-law, Mardonius. This initial foray was aimed at Thrace and Macedon, bringing them under Persian control. But a severe storm off the coast of Mount Athos decimated the Persian fleet. This was a significant setback, an early warning that the Aegean Sea could be a treacherous ally or enemy, depending on your perspective and how well your ships were built. It was a reminder that even the mightiest empire was still at the mercy of Mother Nature, a force even more unpredictable than an Athenian politician. 2 years later, in 490 BCE, Darius launched a more direct invasion. This time, the fleet sailed straight across the Aegean, bypassing the treacherous Athos, aiming directly for Athens and Eretria. Eretria fell after a siege, its inhabitants enslaved, fulfilling at least one part of Darius's retribution. Then came the fateful landing at the Bay of Marathon, some 26 miles from Athens. This was it, the moment the small, fractious Greek city-states faced the full might of the Persian war machine. It was a clash of civilizations, a showdown between imperial ambition and burgeoning democratic ideals. Historians still argue whether Darius's primary goal was outright conquest or simply to punish Athens and secure his western flank. Perhaps it was a combination, an imperial flex that escalated into something much larger than initially intended. The stage was set for one of history's most famous battles, a tale of unlikely heroes and a testament to the power of a unified defense, even among often squabbling neighbors. The vastness of the Persian Empire, its resources, and its diverse army were about to come face to face with the determined, albeit numerically inferior, hoplites of Athens and their allies. The sheer disparity in forces and the high stakes involved made these initial clashes not just military engagements, but legendary moments that would forever define the future of both the East and the West. It was like a giant, well-oiled machine going up against a surprisingly nimble and fiercely independent small robot. The outcome wasn't as certain as one might expect. The stage was set, the Aegean Sea had been crossed, and the vast Persian war machine, under the direct command of Datis and Artaphernes, was now poised on the plains of Attica. The immediate aftermath of the previous section, remember, was the fall of Eretria and the subsequent landing at Marathon. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was the moment of truth for Athens. With the Persian force, estimated to be anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 men arrayed against them, the Athenians could only muster about 10,000 hoplites, citizen soldiers famed for their heavy armor and phalanx formation. The odds looked, shall we say, a little lopsided, like bringing a pocket knife to a bazooka fight. The Athenian general, Miltiades, understood the gravity of the situation. He knew that a direct, head-on assault against the Persian cavalry in the open plain would be suicide. Instead, he made a bold, unorthodox move, much to the initial consternation of some of his co-commanders. He strengthened the flanks of his phalanx while intentionally weakening the center, a risky maneuver that aimed to envelop the Persian lines once they advanced. It was a bit like stretching a rubber band thin in the middle so it could snap back harder on the ends. On that fateful day in 490 BCE, the Athenians, spurred on by the urgent plea for aid from Plataea, their only ally who actually showed up, charged the Persian lines at a run, a truly unheard-of tactic for hoplites. This sprint, probably a jog for heavily armored men, minimized their exposure to Persian arrows. The Battle of Marathon was a stunning, improbable Greek victory. The weakened Athenian center initially gave ground, drawing the Persians deeper into the trap, but then the reinforced flanks wheeled inward, crushing the Persian forces. The disciplined, heavily armed hoplites proved devastating against the lighter armored Persian infantry, who, despite their numerical superiority, were not accustomed to such a direct, sustained frontal assault. The Persians, demoralized and disoriented, broke and fled to their ships. The sight of them scrambling back into their vessels, leaving behind thousands of dead, must have been utterly exhilarating for the Athenians. A quirky tidbit from the battle. The runner, Pheidippides, according to legend, ran all the way from Marathon to Athens, about 26 miles, hence the modern marathon race, to announce the victory with the single word, Nike, victory, before promptly collapsing and dying. A dramatic, if likely apocryphal end to a heroic effort. Fast forward 10 years. Darius I had died, consumed by his desire for vengeance against the Greeks, and his son Xerxes I had ascended to the throne. Xerxes was determined to complete what his father had started, and he planned an invasion on a scale previously unimaginable. This was no punitive expedition. This was an attempt to truly conquer and incorporate Greece into the Persian Empire, his preparations were monumental. Canals were dug, pontoon bridges were built across the Hellespont to move his immense army from Asia into Europe, and supplies were amassed. The sheer logistical challenge was immense, a testament to the organizational power of the Persian Empire. Historians still argue about the exact size of Xerxes' invasion force, with ancient sources claiming millions, while modern estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 combatants, plus a massive support contingent. Whatever the number, it was enormous. As Xerxes' army advanced, the Greek city-states, despite their habitual squabbling, finally began to unite under the leadership of Sparta and Athens. They decided to make their stand at a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a place where the geography favored the defender. Here, in 480 BCE, a small force of Greeks, famously led by King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 elite Spartan warriors, along with several thousand other Greek allies, faced the vanguard of the massive Persian army. The plan was to hold the pass, delaying the Persian advance and allowing the main Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy at Artemisium. For 2 glorious days, the Spartans and their allies held the pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks, inflicting heavy casualties. The Persians, despite their numbers, could not effectively deploy their forces in the narrow terrain. It was a brutal, up-close fight, a testament to the Spartans' discipline and courage. The quirk? There's a story that when told the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior famously retorted, "So much the better, we shall fight in the shade." This little piece of bravado captures the Spartan spirit perfectly. However, on the 3rd day, a local Greek traitor named Ephialtes revealed a hidden goat path around the pass, allowing the Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, to outflank the Greek defenders. Knowing they were doomed, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied troops, staying behind with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans to fight to the last man, buying time for the main Greek force to retreat and reorganize. Their sacrifice at Thermopylae became a legendary act of defiance, a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds, even if it was technically a Persian victory. The path was open, and the heartland of Greece lay vulnerable to the advancing Persian tide. With the heroic, though ultimately doomed, stand at Thermopylae now etched into the annals of history, the path to central Greece lay open for Xerxes' mighty army. Athens, the very heart of Greek resistance, was next. The Athenians, led by the brilliant, if often controversial statesman Themistocles, made a truly agonizing decision. They evacuated their city. Imagine abandoning your home, your history, everything you knew, to the mercy of an invading army. It was a strategic retreat, designed to preserve their fighting force and, crucially, their fleet. Xerxes' forces marched into an empty Athens, sacked and burned the Acropolis, a symbolic act of vengeance for the burning of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. The fires of Athens lit up the sky, a stark reminder of Persian might. But the Athenians weren't there to be conquered. They were out at sea, waiting. The focus now shifted to the sea. The Persian navy, immense and diverse, was critical for supplying Xerxes' vast army and completing the conquest of Greece. The Greek fleet, though smaller, was composed primarily of Athenian triremes, agile, highly maneuverable warships designed for ramming. Themistocles understood that the Greeks' only chance was to lure the Persian fleet into a confined space where their numerical superiority would be negated and the Greek ship's agility could be maximized. He played a cunning trick, sending a supposed traitor to Xerxes, advising him to block the escape routes of the Greek fleet from the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland. Xerxes, perhaps overconfident after his land victories, fell for the ruse. He wanted a decisive naval engagement, and he got one. The Battle of Salamis, fought in September 480 BCE, was the pivotal moment of the Persian Wars. It was a chaotic, brutal affair in the narrow straits. The Persian ships, larger and more numerous, found themselves jammed together, unable to maneuver, their rows of oars clashing and tangling. The smaller, faster Greek triremes, familiar with the local waters, darted in and out, ramming and sinking Persian vessels. It was a bit like trying to navigate a fleet of supertankers through a narrow canal filled with agile speedboats. Xerxes himself famously watched the battle unfold from a golden throne on Mount Aigaleo overlooking the strait, a front-row seat to the catastrophic unraveling of his naval power. The destruction of the Persian fleet was absolute and devastating. It shattered Xerxes' supply lines and effectively ended his hopes of conquering Greece by sea. A quirky detail. It's said that some of the Ionian Greek contingents fighting to the Persians, disheartened by the battle's turn, secretly switched sides or simply sailed away. Historians still argue whether the Persian defeat was primarily due to Greek tactical genius, the unfavorable terrain, or the sheer unwieldiness of the massive Persian fleet. It was likely a combination of all three, a perfect storm for the Persians. With his navy crippled, Xerxes, concerned about being cut off from Asia, decided to retreat with a significant portion of his army, leaving behind his general Mardonius with a sizable force to finish the conquest the following spring. Mardonius wintered in Thessaly and then, in 479 BCE, attempted to break the stalemate by offering the Athenians a generous peace, hoping to detach them from the Spartan-led alliance. The Athenians, however, famously refused, proclaiming that they would never betray the Greek cause for any amount of gold. The final major confrontation came at the Battle of Plataea in August 479 BCE. Mardonius, with his remaining Persian and allied Greek forces, faced a united Greek army led by the Spartan Pausanias, one of the largest Greek armies ever assembled. The battle was a long, drawn-out affair, characterized by maneuvering, skirmishes, and a general reluctance from both sides to engage in a decisive battle on unfavorable terms. However, a miscalculation by Mardonius, combined with the superior discipline and heavy armament of the Greek hoplites, eventually led to a decisive Greek victory. Mardonius himself was killed, and his army was routed, suffering immense casualties. It was a complete and utter defeat for the Persian land forces, signaling the end of their ambitions in mainland Greece. Almost simultaneously, according to Herodotus, another Greek victory occurred at the Battle of Mycale, off the coast of Ionia. The remaining Persian fleet was cornered and destroyed by the Greeks, leading to another Ionian revolt against Persian rule. These twin victories at Plataea and Mycale marked the definitive end of the Persian Wars. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, despite its vastness and resources, had been repelled by the surprisingly resilient and unified Greek city-states. The Greeks had not only defended their independence, but had cemented their own identity, forging a sense of Hellenic unity in the crucible of war. For Persia, it was a humiliating setback, a reminder that even the strongest empire could be challenged, and sometimes even defeated, by a determined and innovative foe. The empire would endure, but its aura of invincibility had been irrevocably tarnished. The echoes of the Persian Wars, those clashes that had so dramatically pitted East against West, had faded, but their impact on the Achaemenid Empire was profound. While the Greeks celebrated their unlikely triumph, Persia was left to pick up the pieces, and the task of doing so fell squarely on the shoulders of Xerxes III. Remember him? The king who watched his navy get decimated at Salamis and then retreated back across the Hellespont? He had grand ambitions, and while the Greek adventure was a monumental failure, his reign wasn't solely defined by it. Xerxes returned to Persia facing a wounded ego and a very real need to reassert his authority. The failed invasion of Greece, though militarily a setback rather than an existential threat to the vast empire, nonetheless chipped away at the aura of invincibility carefully cultivated by Cyrus and Darius. He needed to prove that Persia was still the undisputed superpower. To that end, he poured immense resources into monumental construction projects, particularly at Persepolis. He expanded the magnificent palaces, built the monumental Gate of All Nations, a truly impressive welcome mat for visitors from across the empire, and adorned the complex with reliefs depicting the empire's vastness and the myriad peoples paying homage to the king. This was essentially a massive public relations campaign in stone designed to showcase imperial might and stability, reminding everyone that despite a little Greek hiccup, Persia was still very much in business. It was like a modern corporation launching a huge rebranding campaign after a public scandal, all to restore confidence and project an image of unwavering strength. Beyond the stone and mortar, Xerxes had to contend with the internal dynamics of a multi-ethnic empire. Egypt, always a restless province, revolted again shortly after the Greek debacle, prompting a harsh reassertion of Persian control. Babylon, too, rebelled, leading Xerxes to crush the uprising with particular severity, reportedly stripping the city of its cult statue of Marduk, a deeply symbolic act that alienated the powerful Babylonian priesthood. This marked a shift in Persian policy towards conquered territories. While Cyrus had embraced local traditions, Xerxes seemed more inclined towards heavy-handed repression when faced with defiance. Historians still argue whether Xerxes' harshness in Egypt and Babylon was a calculated strategic shift or a reaction born of frustration from his Greek failures. Perhaps it was a king lashing out after a very public humiliation. One of the more quirky tidbits from Xerxes' post-Greek period concerns the royal harem and the political intrigues within the Persian court. Stories abound of Xerxes' tumultuous personal life, including his alleged affair with his brother's wife and the brutal mutilation of her mother, Amestris. While these accounts from Greek sources, again, might be exaggerated for dramatic effect, they highlight the intense, often violent power struggles and personal vendettas that simmered beneath the surface of the imperial court. It was a bit like a particularly cutthroat season of a historical drama, complete with ambitious queens, conniving eunuchs, and plenty of backstabbing, literal and metaphorical. Despite the failures in Greece and the internal unrest, the Achaemenid Empire under Xerxes remained vast and incredibly wealthy. The royal road continued to function, tribute flowed into the imperial coffers, and the satrapies, though occasionally restive, generally remained under control. However, a creeping sense of decline, a subtle unraveling, began to set in. The sheer scale of the empire, once its greatest strength, also presented its greatest challenge. Maintaining control over such vast distances, with diverse populations and ambitious local rulers, required constant vigilance and powerful leadership. Xerxes, though initially energetic, seemed to become more consumed by court life and less focused on direct governance in his later years. His reign ultimately ended in 465 BCE, not on the battlefield, but through assassination within his own palace. The circumstances are murky, but it is widely believed he was murdered by Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard, possibly in league with other courtiers. This was not just a regicide. It signaled a growing trend of palace intrigue and instability that would increasingly plague the Achaemenid dynasty in the centuries to come. The era of the great kings, who personally led armies and forged empires, was giving way to a period where internal power struggles, assassinations, and ambitious courtiers would play a more significant role in shaping the empire's destiny. The grand architectural projects continued, but the foundations of political stability, once so robust under Darius, were starting to show the first hairline cracks. The empire was still mighty, but the unifying force at its head was becoming less consistent, leading to an increasing reliance on its established institutions rather than the sheer force of a single king's will. With the turbulent reign and sudden assassination of Xerxes I, the Achaemenid Empire found itself at a crossroads. The era of the grand conquering kings, who personally led vast armies into battle and returned victorious, mostly, was slowly receding. The focus shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, from relentless expansion to maintaining the immense existing dominion. And it was Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' third son, who ascended to the peacock throne in 465 BCE, tasked with navigating these new imperial realities. He would reign for an impressive 40 years, one of the longest reigns in Achaemenid history, providing a period of relative stability after the regicide that brought him to power. Artaxerxes' reign largely centered on consolidating power and managing the intricate web of diplomacy and occasional rebellion across his vast territories. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't launch any grand invasions of Europe. Instead, his foreign policy was largely one of cautious engagement, primarily with the Greek world, which was still buzzing with the aftershocks of the Persian Wars. The Delian League, led by Athens, continued to challenge Persian influence in the Aegean and Asia Minor, prompting sporadic naval clashes and land engagements. It was a prolonged Cold War, occasionally turning hot, a bit like two rival superpowers constantly jostling for influence on the global stage. The most significant achievement of Artaxerxes' reign in terms of foreign policy was the signing of the Peace of Callias around 449 BCE. This treaty, named after the Athenian envoy who supposedly negotiated it, though historians still argue whether it was a formal treaty or a series of agreements, effectively ended the major hostilities between the Persian Empire and Athens and its allies. Its terms, while debated, are generally understood to have stipulated that Persia would not send its forces into the Aegean Sea, and that the Greek cities of Asia Minor would be granted autonomy. In return, the Greeks would cease their aggressive incursions into Persian territory. It was a diplomatic victory for both sides, allowing Athens to consolidate its maritime empire and Persia to focus on its internal affairs without the constant drain of Western conflicts. It's a quirky thought that after decades of bloody warfare, peace was finally achieved, not by a decisive battle, but by a bunch of clever diplomats hammering out terms. Internally, Artaxerxes largely continued the administrative systems established by Darius I. The satrapies continued to function, tribute flowed, and the royal road remained the empire's central nervous system. However, the seeds of internal decay that had begun to sprout under Xerxes continued to grow. Palace intrigues became more pronounced, eunuchs and royal women gained increasing influence, and the struggle for succession after a king's death often descended into bloody feuds. Maintaining central authority over ambitious satraps, especially those far from Susa or Persepolis, became a perennial challenge. It was like managing a huge multinational corporation from a single headquarters, trying to keep track of every regional manager's aspirations. One of the more fascinating, if slightly fringe, tidbits from this era is the account of Themistocles, the Athenian hero of Salamis, who, after being ostracized and exiled from Athens, sought refuge at the Persian court of Artaxerxes. Instead of executing his former enemy, Artaxerxes, in a move echoing Cyrus's earlier magnanimity, reportedly welcomed Themistocles and granted him lands and cities to govern. This act of patronage highlights the Persian willingness to incorporate talented individuals, even former adversaries, into their system, a testament to their pragmatic approach to governance. Historians still argue whether Themistocles genuinely served the Persian king loyally or if he harbored ulterior motives. What a story, though! The ultimate defector, finding a comfortable retirement with his former foe. Artaxerxes also oversaw the continued development of Persepolis, though perhaps not with the same fervent zeal as his father. The empire, under his long and relatively stable rule, became a byword for wealth and luxury. The image of the great king, ensconced in his magnificent palaces, surrounded by countless servants and treasures, became ingrained in the Greek imagination. This wealth, however, also presented a vulnerability. The vast sums held in the royal treasuries and the tribute extracted from the provinces became an irresistible temptation for ambitious courtiers and rebellious satraps. By the end of Artaxerxes' reign, the Achaemenid Empire was still undeniably the dominant power of the ancient Near East. It had weathered the storm of the Persian Wars, maintained its vast territorial integrity, and even achieved a period of relative peace with its most persistent external adversary. However, the subtle shifts towards increased palace intrigue and the growing autonomy of some satraps hinted at challenges that would escalate in the coming decades. The central authority, though still formidable, was beginning to show signs of strain, laying the groundwork for the more turbulent periods that would follow his long and peaceful rule. Following the impressive 4-decade reign of Artaxerxes I, a period of relative calm for the vast Achaemenid Empire, the political winds shifted, ushering in an era less about grand conquests or monumental building, and more about the murky world of palace intrigue. The stability that Artaxerxes had painstakingly cultivated began to fray at the edges, not through external threats initially, but from within the very heart of the royal court. This brings us to the reign of Darius II, a king whose ascent to the throne was less about divine right and more about who was the last man standing in a particularly bloody family feud. Artaxerxes' death in 424 BCE was immediately followed by a rapid-fire succession of 3 of his sons, each vying for the throne, often lasting mere days or weeks before meeting a violent end. It was like a very high-stakes game of musical chairs, but with daggers and poison. First, Xerxes II briefly ruled, only to be assassinated by his half-brother Sogdianus. Sogdianus himself didn't last long before being overthrown and executed by another half-brother, Ochus, who then took the regnal name Darius II. His original name, Ochus, is a bit of a quirky detail, suggesting a rather less majestic start for a man who would rule an empire. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind these rapid successions, whether it was pure ambition, pre-existing rivalries, or manipulation by powerful eunuchs and queens. It was a messy business, to say the least, and certainly not the kind of stable transition that inspires confidence in the monarchy. Darius II's reign, 424 to 404 BCE, was largely characterized by this pervasive atmosphere of palace intrigue and internal politicking. He was not a king, known for his military leadership or grand imperial visions, but rather for his reliance on powerful courtiers, particularly eunuchs, and the influence of his strong-willed wife, Parysatis. Parysatis was a formidable figure, often described as ambitious and ruthless, playing a significant role in the various power struggles and assassinations that marked the court. She was the quintessential power behind the throne, pulling strings and manipulating events with the skill of a seasoned puppet master. Her influence was a fringe tidbit that paints a vivid picture of the internal dynamics where the king was not always the sole decision-maker, and familial loyalty often took a back seat to personal ambition. During this period, the central authority of the great king began to wane. While the empire remained vast and superficially intact, the control from Susa and Persepolis over the far-flung satrapies became less firm. Satraps, especially those on the peripheries of the empire, increasingly acted with greater autonomy, raising their own armies, forging their own alliances, and sometimes even withholding tribute. This growing independence was a significant challenge to the unified structure that Darius I had so carefully built. It was a bit like a highly centralized corporation, starting to see its regional offices go rogue, each developing its own business plan. Despite the internal squabbles, Persia still played a crucial, if indirect, role in the affairs of the Greek world. During the latter stages of the Peloponnesian War, the epic conflict between Athens and Sparta, Darius II skillfully exploited the rivalry between the two Greek powers. Persia provided financial support, primarily to Sparta, recognizing that a weakened and divided Greece was far less of a threat than a unified one. This policy of playing one Greek city-state against another, often referred to as divide and conquer diplomacy, was a mainstream historical fact of this era. Persian gold flowed into Spartan coffers, enabling them to build a navy capable of challenging Athenian supremacy. It was a clever strategy, letting the Greeks exhaust themselves fighting each other, while Persia maintained its vast wealth and influence from a comfortable distance. Darius II's reign didn't see any major territorial losses, but it certainly didn't see any significant gains either. It was a period of maintenance, or perhaps slow erosion. The administrative machinery continued to grind along. The satraps collected taxes, and the empire's vast resources continued to accumulate, but the dynamism of earlier reigns was largely absent. The energy of the court was often consumed by jockeying for position, dealing with the occasional revolt in a far-flung province, or managing the intricate relationships between powerful royal family members. When Darius II finally died in 404 BCE, presumably of natural causes, a rarity for Persian kings of this turbulent period, he left behind an empire that was outwardly strong but inwardly increasingly fragile. His reign underscored a critical shift in the character of the Achaemenid monarchy. The focus had moved away from the external projection of power to the internal struggle for it. This period of sustained internal maneuvering and declining royal authority set the stage for even more dramatic family conflicts and the eventual rise of a new challenger who would directly test the limits of imperial power. The stage was being set for a particularly bitter and public family dispute, one that would nearly tear the empire apart. The death of Darius II, a king who had perhaps perfected the art of surviving through palace intrigue rather than conquering new lands, ushered in arguably one of the most dramatic and openly violent succession crises in the history of the Achaemenid Empire. The stage was set for a truly epic sibling rivalry, a conflict so significant it was meticulously documented by ancient Greek historians like Xenophon, who even participated in it. This brings us to the reign of Artaxerxes II and the fierce challenge mounted by his ambitious younger brother, Cyrus the Younger. Artaxerxes II, whose given name was Arsaces, was the eldest son of Darius II and Parysatis, the formidable queen who, as we remember, had a knack for manipulating events. When his father died in 404 BCE, Arsaces ascended to the throne, taking the regnal name Artaxerxes II. He was, by many accounts, a mild-mannered man, perhaps not ideally suited for the brutal world of Persian imperial politics. However, he had one critical advantage. His mother, Parysatis, initially supported him, though her loyalties would prove to be quite fluid throughout this saga. His younger brother Cyrus, nicknamed the Younger to distinguish him from Cyrus the Great, was a man of entirely different temperament. He was ambitious, charismatic, and had already proven his military and administrative capabilities as satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia in Asia Minor. He had also cultivated strong ties with Greek mercenaries, particularly during the Peloponnesian War, where he generously funded Sparta. Cyrus believed he had a stronger claim to the throne, arguing that he was born after Darius II had become king, unlike Artaxerxes, who was born before. This rather flimsy legalistic argument masked a much more potent drive for power. It was like two brothers fighting over the remote control, except the remote control was an entire empire, and the consequences of losing were, well, terminal. Cyrus the Younger began secretly amassing a large army, composed primarily of Greek mercenaries, known famously as the 10,000, along with his loyal Persian troops. This was a bold and incredibly dangerous undertaking, essentially an act of treason on a grand scale. He marched inland from the coast of Asia Minor in 401 BCE, ostensibly to suppress a rebellion, but his true target was painfully clear: his brother on the imperial throne. Artaxerxes II, initially caught off guard, quickly mobilized his own vast forces, drawing troops from across the empire. The climactic confrontation occurred at the Battle of Cunaxa, near Babylon, in 401 BCE. It was a massive engagement, pitting Cyrus's relatively small but highly disciplined Greek mercenary force against Artaxerxes' much larger, more diverse imperial army. The Greek contingent under Cyrus fought brilliantly, routing the Persian left flank. However, the turning point came when Cyrus, in a moment of audacious folly, spotted his brother Artaxerxes in the thick of the battle and charged directly at him, hoping to kill him and seize the throne personally. It was a true brother-against-brother moment, almost too dramatic to be real. A quirky detail: ancient sources claim that Cyrus almost succeeded, even wounding Artaxerxes, before he himself was struck down by a javelin and killed. Historians still argue about the precise circumstances of Cyrus's death. Was it a chaotic accident in the melee, or was he specifically targeted by the royal bodyguard? Regardless, his death immediately ended the rebellion. The aftermath of Cunaxa was perhaps even more famous than the battle itself, thanks to Xenophon's Anabasis, the march upcountry. With Cyrus dead, his 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves deep within enemy territory, leaderless and surrounded. Their incredible, arduous march back to the Black Sea, constantly harassed by Persian forces, battling through harsh terrain and hostile tribes, became a legendary feat of endurance and military discipline. It was a testament to the fighting prowess of the Greek hoplites and, inadvertently, a stark demonstration of the Achaemenid Empire's surprising difficulty in completely annihilating a well-organized, albeit relatively small, enemy force within its own heartland. Artaxerxes II's long reign, 404 to 358 BCE, was thus inaugurated by this traumatic sibling war, which permanently scarred the royal family and highlighted the fragility of succession. Though victorious, Artaxerxes continued to face challenges. Another rebellion in Egypt, which gained its independence during this period and remained stubbornly outside Persian control for decades, and the so-called Great Satraps' Revolt in Asia Minor, circa 366 to 360 BCE, where several powerful satraps openly rebelled against the king. These revolts, though ultimately suppressed, further weakened central authority and showcased the growing decentralization of power. Artaxerxes II's reign, while long and outwardly stable, was defined by this internal strife and the empire's struggle to maintain its vast holdings. He was not a weak king, but the very nature of his ascent and the challenges he faced revealed the deep-seated vulnerabilities of the Achaemenid system. The empire, though immense, was starting to show signs of internal rot, a slow but steady decline in centralized control that would eventually pave the way for a truly formidable external challenge. The era of internal feuding had reached a new peak, leaving the empire vulnerable to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Having weathered the storm of his brother's audacious rebellion and endured the slow burn of independent satraps, Artaxerxes II finally shuffled off the imperial coil in 358 BCE. His extraordinarily long reign, remember, was a period of sustained internal struggle and the creeping decentralization of power. But the Achaemenid Empire, despite its internal squabbles and the loss of Egypt, still possessed immense resources and a deep-rooted administrative structure. It needed a strong hand, a king who wasn't afraid to be ruthless, to reassert central authority and remind everyone just who was boss. That firm hand belonged to Artaxerxes III, and he truly lived up to his unofficial nickname, Iron Fist. Artaxerxes III, originally named Ochus, yes, another one, was another son of Artaxerxes II, and like his father, he had to fight for the throne. His ascension was marked by a particularly brutal purge of his own family members and potential rivals, reportedly executing all of his brothers and numerous nephews to secure his position. This isn't just palace intrigue, it's practically a royal bloodbath. It was a clear, if gruesome, message to anyone considering challenging his authority. This king meant business. This kind of ruthless consolidation of power, while horrific, often set the stage for periods of renewed imperial strength, as it certainly did in his case. Historians still argue whether his cruelty was a sign of paranoia or a calculated strategy to prevent the kind of prolonged succession crisis that had plagued his father's early reign. Perhaps a bit of both, a king utterly unwilling to share power. Once on the throne, Artaxerxes III set about restoring the empire's prestige and reasserting its control over rebellious provinces. His main target, the one that had been a thorn in Persia's side for decades, was Egypt. Egypt had gained its independence during the reign of Artaxerxes II and had successfully repelled several Persian attempts to reconquer it. This wasn't just about recovering lost territory, it was a matter of imperial pride and a practical necessity, given Egypt's immense wealth and strategic location. In 343 BCE, after an earlier failed attempt, Artaxerxes III personally led a massive invasion force into Egypt. He was a capable military commander, a stark contrast to some of his immediate predecessors. The campaign was decisive. The Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II was defeated, and Egypt was brought back under direct Persian rule. This was a significant achievement, demonstrating that the Achaemenid Empire, despite its internal woes, still possessed formidable military power when wielded effectively. It was like a sleeping giant, finally rousing itself and flexing its muscles, much to the chagrin of anyone who thought they could get away with defiance. A quirky detail: Artaxerxes III reportedly adopted a particularly harsh policy towards the conquered Egyptians, destroying temples and carrying off religious artifacts. This was a sharp departure from the more tolerant policies of Cyrus the Great, highlighting a hardening of Persian imperial rule. Beyond Egypt, Artaxerxes III also suppressed revolts in Phoenicia and Cyprus, further solidifying Persian control over the eastern Mediterranean. He also maintained Persia's influence in the Greek world, continuing the policy of playing the Greek city-states against each other, ensuring they remained divided and too preoccupied with internal conflicts to pose a unified threat to the empire. Persian gold still flowed, subtly influencing the political landscape of Greece, keeping various factions aligned with Persian interests. It was a sophisticated geopolitical game, where proxy wars and financial leverage were the weapons of choice. Artaxerxes III's reign, though relatively short compared to his father's, was a period of renewed vigor for the Achaemenid Empire. He temporarily halted the internal decay, brought rebellious regions back into line, and restored a sense of centralized authority. He was undoubtedly a brutal ruler, but his methods were effective in shoring up the empire at a time when it desperately needed strong leadership. He proved that the core institutions and resources of the empire were still incredibly robust, capable of launching and sustaining major military campaigns. However, even the Iron Fist could not escape the pervasive culture of palace intrigue that had become so endemic to the Achaemenid court. His reign, too, ended violently. In 338 BCE, he was poisoned by his powerful eunuch minister, Bagoas, who then proceeded to place a succession of puppet kings on the throne, further highlighting the fragility of royal authority when overshadowed by ambitious courtiers. This assassination, coming at a time when the empire seemed to be regaining its strength, was a tragic blow. Historians still argue whether Bagoas acted out of personal ambition, fear of the king's unpredictable cruelty, or perhaps even in collaboration with disgruntled factions within the court. It was a grim reminder that even the most formidable ruler could fall victim to the silent, deadly machinations within his own palace. The death of Artaxerxes III marked the beginning of a rapid decline. His successors, two more short-lived puppet kings, were unable to maintain the strong grip he had established. The empire, though seemingly powerful, was about to face its ultimate test, a challenge from a source that would prove to be far more formidable than any internal rebellion or bickering Greek city-state. The strong king was gone, and the stage was being set for the final, cataclysmic confrontation that would reshape the ancient world forever. The sudden, violent demise of Artaxerxes III, the strong man who had so decisively wrestled the Achaemenid Empire back from the brink of internal fragmentation, plunged the Persian court into another bewildering cycle of regicide and instability. His eunuch minister, Bagoas, now practically the kingmaker, installed a short-lived puppet named Arses, only to murder him and his family a mere 2 years later. This wasn't governance, it was a particularly morbid game of musical chairs. Into this incredibly precarious vacuum stepped Darius III, a distant cousin of the previous kings, who ascended to the throne in 336 BCE. He was initially known as Codomanus before taking the regal name Darius, perhaps hoping to invoke the spirit of the great organizer, Darius I. Little did he know, he was inheriting an empire on the precipice, facing a storm unlike any it had ever encountered. Darius III was by all accounts a man of considerable personal courage and a decent administrator. He had proven himself in battle before becoming king, leading a successful campaign against rebellious Caduceans. He managed to outmaneuver and then eliminate Bagoas, finally ridding the court of that dangerously powerful eunuch. This act alone signaled that Darius III was not content to be a puppet. He aimed to restore the direct authority of the great king, much like Artaxerxes III had done. He was trying to steady a ship that was already taking on water, and he did so with commendable resolve. A quirky tidbit: Darius III reportedly had a very imposing physical presence, which, while not a military advantage, certainly added to his regal aura. However, the political landscape outside Persia was shifting dramatically, and the Achaemenid Empire, despite its immense resources, was slow to fully grasp the magnitude of the new threat brewing in the West. For decades, the Greek city-states had been squabbling amongst themselves, easily manipulated by Persian gold. But a new, unifying force had emerged in Macedon, a kingdom to the north of Greece that the Persians had previously paid little mind. Under King Philip II, Macedon had forged a highly disciplined, innovative army and, through a combination of diplomacy and conquest, had brought most of Greece under its hegemony. It was like watching a small regional football team suddenly start winning the global championship, catching everyone off guard. Then, in 336 BCE, just as Darius III was consolidating his power, Philip II was assassinated. His successor was his 20-year-old son, a brilliant and fiercely ambitious military genius named Alexander III, soon to be known to history as Alexander the Great. Alexander wasn't interested in simply punishing the Greeks or playing diplomatic games. He harbored a grand vision of conquering the Persian Empire, a vision nurtured by his tutor, Aristotle, and fueled by stories of Persian wealth and Greek glory. He saw himself as a liberator of the Ionian Greeks and an avenger for the burning of Athens. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown between the two greatest powers of the ancient world. Darius III, therefore, had the unenviable task of defending the colossal Achaemenid Empire against an adversary of unprecedented military talent and boundless ambition. The empire he inherited, while still vast, was no longer the perfectly oiled machine that Darius I had built. The long period of palace intrigue, the semi-autonomous satrapies, and the sheer cultural diversity of its forces meant that it lacked the centralized discipline and unity of command that characterized Alexander's Macedonian army. Historians still argue whether the Persian Empire was in terminal decline before Alexander's arrival, or if it simply met an unstoppable force. It's a classic case of the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object. But in this instance, the object wasn't quite as immovable as it appeared. Darius III, to his credit, understood the gravity of the threat. He began to mobilize the vast resources of the empire, assembling armies drawn from every corner of his dominion: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, and of course, Persians. This diverse host, while impressive in sheer numbers, often lacked cohesion and shared tactical doctrine. The empire was so large that moving these armies, supplying them, and coordinating their movements was a logistical nightmare. The initial encounters were not in Persia's favor. Alexander, having swiftly secured his Macedonian base, crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor in 334 BCE. The first major confrontation would come at a river called the Granicus, a battle that would set the tone for the epic struggle to come, and one that would force Darius III to confront the harsh reality of the challenge facing his ancient and glorious empire. The shadow of Alexander was falling across Persia, and the future of the Achaemenid dynasty hung by a very thin thread. With Alexander the Great having crossed the Hellespont, the final act of the Achaemenid Empire began. Darius III, remember him, the king trying valiantly to steady a wobbling ship? He was about to face the true test of his reign, a clash that would determine not just the fate of an empire, but the trajectory of ancient history itself. The first major confrontation came swiftly, not directly involving Darius III himself, but nonetheless setting an ominous precedent for the Persian side. The initial Persian response to Alexander's invasion of Asia Minor was somewhat fragmented. The various satraps in the region, including the formidable Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary general in Persian service, gathered their forces to confront the Macedonian threat. Their strategy was perhaps a bit too cautious, or perhaps underestimated the lightning speed and audacious tactics of Alexander. They decided to make a stand at the river Granicus in May of 334 BCE. This was a relatively minor river, but its steep banks and the Persian deployment along them offered a seemingly strong defensive position. The Persian cavalry, considered among the best in the world, was positioned prominently, backed by Greek mercenary infantry. Alexander, typically impetuous and brilliant, ignored the advice of his older, more cautious generals who suggested waiting until morning. He ordered an immediate direct assault across the river. It was a risky move, akin to charging uphill into machine gun fire, but it caught the Persians off guard. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissas, pikes, and Alexander's companion cavalry, led by the king himself, smashed into the Persian lines. Alexander was even reportedly saved from death by his general Clytus the Black during the furious fighting. The battle was chaotic and brutal, but the superior discipline, training, and unified command of the Macedonians quickly overwhelmed the more loosely organized Persian forces. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, though brave, were ultimately outmaneuvered and cut down. The Persian cavalry, despite its skill, couldn't effectively counter the coordinated Macedonian attack in the confined terrain. The Battle of Granicus was a resounding Macedonian victory and a psychological blow to the Persians. It opened up Asia Minor to Alexander and demonstrated unequivocally that the Macedonian army was not to be underestimated. It also highlighted a key weakness of the Persian command structure: the lack of a single, unifying military genius to match Alexander. A quirky detail from the aftermath: Alexander, after the battle, sent 300 suits of Persian armor as an offering to Athens, with an inscription that read, "Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks accept the Spartans from the barbarians who live in Asia." A subtle jab at Sparta and a clear statement of purpose. Historians still argue whether the Persian commanders at Granicus truly had a unified strategy or if their disparate forces led to tactical errors. It was likely a combination of factors, but the outcome was undeniable. Following Granicus, Alexander methodically moved through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities, or more accurately, installing pro-Macedonian governments and consolidating his gains. Darius III, meanwhile, was fully aware of the escalating threat. He began to personally organize an even larger army, drawing forces from the heartland of the empire, determined to face Alexander himself. He chose a battlefield that he believed would favor his superior numbers and cavalry, the narrow plain of Issus, located in a strategic pass between mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. The Battle of Issus, fought in November of 333 BCE, was the first direct confrontation between Alexander and Darius III. Darius brought an immense army, perhaps as many as 100,000 to 200,000 men. Again, numbers are debated, but it was vast. He had positioned his forces to exploit their numerical advantage, but Alexander, with his smaller, more cohesive army, once again displayed his tactical brilliance. He launched a daring cavalry charge, personally leading his companion cavalry on the right flank, smashing through the Persian left. The Macedonian phalanx held firm in the center, and the battle quickly turned into a chaotic melee. The decisive moment came when Alexander, in a move reminiscent of Cyrus the Younger's fatal charge, directly targeted Darius III's position in the center. Darius, despite his personal courage, found himself in a desperate situation. His chariots were rendered ineffective by the rough terrain and obstacles, and his elite bodyguard was overwhelmed. Seeing his lines breaking and his personal safety compromised, Darius III made the agonizing decision to flee the battlefield, abandoning his family, including his mother, wife, and daughters, and his royal treasury. This was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically and symbolically. It was an almost unthinkable act for a great king. The Battle of Issus was another crushing defeat for Persia. Alexander captured Darius's entire camp, including his family, whom he treated with surprising respect and courtesy, a clever propaganda move that further undermined Darius's authority. The two early losses at Granicus and Issus exposed critical weaknesses in the Persian military strategy and command. Despite their immense resources and brave soldiers, the Persians struggled to counter Alexander's innovative tactics. The disciplined shock of his phalanx and his almost superhuman personal leadership. The empire, though vast, was being picked apart, piece by piece, and the final cataclysmic confrontation was looming ever closer. The next battle would be for the very heart and soul of Persia. After the crushing defeat at Issus, where Darius III had been forced to abandon his family and flee the field, the Achaemenid Empire was reeling. Alexander the Great, with two decisive victories under his belt, now controlled Asia Minor and the Levant. But he wasn't about to march directly on the Persian heartland just yet. Instead, he made a strategic decision, one that baffled some of his own generals. He turned south, aiming for Egypt. This detour was crucial for two reasons: to secure his flank and deny Persia its immense naval resources, and to cut off the empire's vast wealth, particularly the grain of the Nile. Alexander's campaign through Phoenicia and Egypt was methodical and relentless. He besieged the island city of Tyre, a formidable naval base, for 7 grueling months, eventually building a massive causeway to reach it, a feat of engineering that truly deserves a moment of quiet awe. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BCE, it marked the end of Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. Then on to Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, crowned as pharaoh, and even founded the legendary city of Alexandria. This period of consolidation in Egypt further weakened Darius, who was trying desperately to reassemble his forces in the east. It was a masterclass in strategic maneuvering, isolating the main enemy by depriving them of key resources and allies. Meanwhile, Darius III, back in the heartland of his empire, was doing everything in his power to prepare for the inevitable final confrontation. He knew this was it. The very existence of the Achaemenid Empire hinged on the next battle. He gathered an even larger army than before, drawing troops from every corner of his vast domain, including elephants from India. This time, he chose his ground carefully. A vast, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, close to modern-day Mosul in Iraq. He had the ground meticulously leveled, removing any obstacles that might impede his cavalry or hinder his scythed chariots, those terrifying contraptions designed to mow down infantry like wheat. He was leaving nothing to chance, or so he hoped. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on October 1st, 331 BCE, was the climactic showdown. This was not just a battle, it was the largest engagement of the ancient world to date, a clash of empires on an epic scale. Darius commanded an army that dwarfed Alexander's, estimated by ancient sources to be as high as 1 million men, though modern historians more conservatively suggest between 200,000 and 300,000, still a massive numerical superiority. Alexander had perhaps 47,000 highly trained Macedonians and Greeks. The sheer disparity in numbers was astounding, like facing a horde with a disciplined but tiny army. The battle itself was a masterpiece of Alexander's tactical genius and the discipline of his forces. Darius's strategy relied on his overwhelming numbers and his scythed chariots to break the Macedonian lines. However, Alexander countered the chariots with innovative tactics, opening up his phalanx to absorb the charge and then trapping the chariots within his ranks, where they were easily dispatched. The most famous and perhaps quirky moment involved Alexander's brilliant maneuver on the right flank. He advanced at an angle, drawing the Persian cavalry wider, creating a gap in the Persian lines. Then, in a sudden, decisive move, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly into this newly created gap, charging straight for Darius himself. Just as at Issus, the sight of Alexander bearing down on him, combined with the collapse of his center, proved too much for Darius. Despite his personal courage, the great king again broke and fled the battlefield, leaving his vast army leaderless and in chaos. This second flight, especially after all the meticulous preparations, was a psychological blow from which the Persian cause would never recover. The vast Persian army, though still numerically superior in many areas of the field, disintegrated once its king had fled. The sheer scale of the rout was immense, with countless Persian soldiers fleeing, pursued relentlessly by the Macedonians. The consequences of Gaugamela were immediate and catastrophic for the Achaemenid Empire. It effectively sealed its fate. Babylon, Susa, and the ceremonial capital of Persepolis, with their immense treasuries, soon fell into Alexander's hands without further significant resistance. The burning of Persepolis by Alexander, a controversial act, often seen as an act of revenge for the burning of Athens, marked the symbolic end of the Achaemenid dynasty. Historians still argue whether the burning was an accidental act of drunken revelry or a deliberate, calculated destruction. Perhaps a bit of both, a fiery exclamation point on the end of an era. Darius III, now a fugitive, attempted to raise a new army further east, but his authority was shattered. He was ultimately betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, who hoped to curry favor with Alexander. When Alexander found Darius's body, he reportedly covered it with his own cloak and gave him a royal burial. The death of Darius III in 330 BCE marked the formal end of the Achaemenid Empire, an unbroken line of great kings stretching back over 2 centuries. A vast, powerful, and historically significant empire had fallen, not to internal decay alone, but to the unstoppable force of a single, brilliant conqueror. The ancient world would never be the same. The smoke from burning Persepolis had barely cleared, and the last vestiges of Achaemenid resistance had crumbled with the death of Darius III. The ancient Persian Empire, for over 2 centuries, the dominant power of the Near East, was no more. But history, as we know, abhors a vacuum. The question now was, what would Alexander do with this colossal inheritance? He hadn't just conquered a kingdom, he had inherited an entire civilization, a vast tapestry of peoples, cultures, and traditions. And his approach was surprisingly nuanced, a blend of brutal conquest and astute political integration. Alexander the Conqueror famously saw himself as the new great king. He wasn't interested in merely plundering Persia. He sought to incorporate it into his own burgeoning empire, a vision of a Hellenistic world stretching from Greece to India. To achieve this, he adopted many Persian customs and administrative practices, a move that often baffled and even angered his Macedonian and Greek companions. He wore Persian dress, appointed Persians to high office, and even encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women in mass ceremonies like the one at Susa. It was a conscious effort to blend cultures, to create a new, hybrid elite, rather than simply imposing Macedonian rule. This policy, often called fusion or East-West synthesis, was a mainstream historical fact of his post-conquest reign. It was a pragmatic move, recognizing that to rule such a vast established empire, one had to work with its existing structures, not simply dismantle them. However, Alexander's Persianization wasn't without its tensions. His Macedonian veterans, who had fought long and hard to conquer this empire, often resented seeing Persians treated as equals, let alone rising to positions of power. They grumbled about the king adopting barbarian customs. This internal dissent, a fascinating fringe tidbit, manifested in various ways, including mutinies and assassination plots, though none succeeded. Alexander, ever the pragmatic ruler, suppressed these revolts harshly, but it showed the deep cultural chasm that even his charisma couldn't entirely bridge. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely believed in a universal Hellenistic culture, or if his adoption of Persian customs was purely a cynical political maneuver to secure his rule. Perhaps it was a gradual evolution, a king growing into the role of an emperor of a diverse realm. Alexander spent the next few years consolidating his control over the eastern satrapies, pushing further into Central Asia, and even briefly invading India. These campaigns were brutal, showcasing his continued military genius, but also the immense toll they took on his army. He founded numerous cities named Alexandria. Estimates range from 20 to 70, strategically placed throughout his empire. These cities were intended to be centers of Hellenistic culture, commerce, and military control, acting as powerful engines of cultural diffusion, spreading Greek language, art, and philosophy throughout the former Persian lands. Think of them as ancient globalized hubs, connecting different parts of his vast domain. But the grand vision of Alexander's empire, stretching from the Adriatic to the Indus, was predicated on his singular leadership. His sudden, unexpected death in Babylon in 323 BCE at the young age of 32 threw his nascent empire into immediate and irreversible chaos. He had no clear successor, and his generals, the Diadochi, successors, immediately began to squabble over the spoils. The idea of a unified empire under a single ruler quickly evaporated. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death was a period of intense, brutal civil wars among his generals. Each sought to carve out a piece of the vast pie for himself, leading to decades of conflict, shifting alliances, and countless battles. It was a grand game of territorial acquisition, played with armies and assassinations. Persia, once the heart of Alexander's empire, became the battleground for these ambitious warlords. Control changed hands frequently, and the land suffered greatly from the constant warfare. The former Persian satrapies, briefly united under Alexander, now found themselves fragmented and under the rule of various Macedonian generals who had little understanding or respect for local customs, unlike Alexander's nuanced approach. The rapid fragmentation of Alexander's empire meant that the brief, unifying period of Macedonian rule over Persia was fleeting. While Hellenistic culture would indeed spread and blend with local traditions, the political unity that Alexander had imposed was gone. The stage was now set for the rise of new, distinctly Hellenistic dynasties that would rule over the former Persian territories, but these dynasties would be foreign, their legitimacy tenuous, and their grasp on the vastness of the former Achaemenid heartland often precarious. The shadow of Persia's old glory would linger, however, inspiring future attempts to reclaim its ancient sovereignty. With Alexander the Great's sudden demise, his vast, hastily assembled empire, remember, shattered into pieces like a dropped vase. The ensuing decades were consumed by the bloody wars of the Diadochi, a relentless power struggle among his generals for control of his immense legacy. For the former Persian heartland, this meant a transition from the direct rule of Alexander to the fragmented control of one of these ambitious successors, and thus began the Seleucid era, a period where Persia found itself under the dominion of a Greek Macedonian dynasty, struggling to impose Hellenistic culture on a deeply rooted ancient civilization. The bulk of the former Achaemenid Empire, stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus River, ultimately fell under the control of Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable generals. He consolidated his power through a series of victories, founding the Seleucid Empire around 312 BCE. This was a truly enormous Hellenistic kingdom, but its sheer size also made it inherently unstable. Seleucus, like Alexander, understood the importance of integrating to some degree with the local populations, but the core of his administration and military remained resolutely Greek Macedonian. It was a bit like trying to run a vast continent-spanning company with only executives who spoke a foreign language and preferred a very specific kind of coffee. The Seleucids established numerous Greek-style cities throughout their territories, especially in Mesopotamia and Iran. These cities, like Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Laodicea, served as military garrisons, administrative centers, and hubs for Hellenistic culture. They were populated by Greek and Macedonian colonists, veterans and merchants, and featured gymnasia, theaters, and temples to Greek gods. This was a deliberate policy of Hellenization, aiming to spread Greek language, art, architecture, and political institutions across the empire. It was a grand cultural experiment, seeking to graft a new civilization onto an old one. Historians still argue about the extent to which Hellenistic culture truly permeated the vast rural areas of Persia, or if it remained largely confined to these new urban centers. Was it a deep assimilation or a thin veneer? The debate continues. However, the vastness of the Seleucid Empire was both its strength and its fatal flaw. The sheer distance between the various satrapies and the imperial core in Syria made effective central control incredibly difficult. Powerful local elites, many of them Persian, often resented the foreign rule and continued to practice their own traditions. The Seleucid kings were constantly battling revolts, not just from the periphery, but from within the heart of their vast domain. The eastern provinces, particularly Iran, were particularly restive and difficult to control. It was like trying to keep a massive, sprawling quilt patched together when the threads were constantly fraying. A quirky tidbit from this period involves the continued veneration of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion. Despite the influx of Greek gods and philosophical ideas, Zoroastrianism continued to be practiced by the majority of the indigenous Persian population, often quite openly. The Seleucids, while promoting their own pantheon, generally tolerated local religious practices, a continuation of the Achaemenid policy of religious pluralism. This resilience of native culture and religion under foreign rule speaks volumes about the deep-seated identity of the Persian people. It was a quiet act of cultural resistance, maintaining their spiritual heritage while the foreigners built their gymnasia. The Seleucid Empire, despite its initial grandeur, was constantly shrinking. Its western territories were lost to the rising power of Rome, and its eastern provinces gradually slipped away. The sheer cost of maintaining such a large empire, combined with constant internal strife and external pressures, eventually proved too much. The process was slow, but inexorable. The Greek ruling class, though numerically small, clung to power, but their grip on the vast lands of Iran began to weaken significantly, opening the door for native resistance. The Hellenistic experiment in Persia, while leaving a lasting cultural imprint, ultimately failed to fully suppress the deeply ingrained Persian identity. The stage was being set for a resurgence, a reassertion of native rule. The next major power to emerge in Iran would not be another Hellenistic successor state, but a group of nomadic warriors from the northeastern steppes who would eventually drive out the Seleucids and establish a new empire, one that deliberately evoked the pre-Hellenistic glory of Persia. The wheel of history was about to turn, bringing an end to direct Greek rule and ushering in a new, distinctively Iranian chapter. The long, often tumultuous reign of the Seleucid Empire over the former Persian heartland, remember, was characterized by a grand experiment in Hellenization, which, while leaving its marks, never quite managed to extinguish the enduring flame of Persian identity. As the Seleucid grasp weakened, particularly in their vast eastern territories, a new power began to emerge from the steppes, a force that would not only drive out the Greek overlords, but also usher in a period of distinctly Iranian resurgence. This brings us to the rise of the Parthian Empire, a formidable new player on the ancient stage. The Parthians were an East Iranian people, originally from the region of Parthia, modern-day northeastern Iran, a satrapy within the Seleucid Empire. They were initially a nomadic, equestrian people, skilled archers and horsemen, whose origins are a bit murky, but whose impact would be undeniable. Around 247 BCE, under the leadership of a chieftain named Cyrus III, they rebelled against Seleucid rule, exploiting the weakness and distractions of the Seleucid kings, who were often preoccupied with wars in the west or internal dissent. It was like a well-organized guerrilla force, suddenly making serious territorial gains against an overstretched superpower. Over the next few decades, the Parthians, under the Arsacid dynasty, named after their founder, steadily expanded their territory, gradually pushing the Seleucids out of Iran. Their success was due to a combination of factors: their highly effective cavalry warfare, particularly the devastating Parthian shot, where riders would shoot arrows backward while seemingly retreating, their ability to exploit Seleucid weaknesses, and their willingness to tolerate local customs and traditions, which gained them the loyalty of many indigenous populations who chafed under Greek rule. This deliberate policy of cultural tolerance, a mainstream historical fact, contrasted sharply with the more overt Hellenization efforts of the Seleucids and played a crucial role in their success. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Parthian Empire was firmly established, stretching from Mesopotamia to the borders of India. It became a powerful rival to the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire, engaging in centuries of intermittent warfare over control of the lucrative trade routes and buffer states in the Near East. These conflicts, particularly over Armenia and Mesopotamia, were legendary for their brutality and strategic complexity. The Parthians famously defeated and killed the Roman triumvir Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, capturing his legionary standards, a profound humiliation for Rome that resonated for decades. Imagine the Roman equivalent of losing your national flag to a rival. It was a deeply symbolic and infuriating loss. The Parthians, while distinct from the Achaemenids, deliberately positioned themselves as the true successors to the ancient Persian Empire. They adopted many Achaemenid titles and traditions, even though their own culture incorporated strong Hellenistic and nomadic influences. Their coinage, for example, often featured Greek inscriptions on one side and Persian or Aramaic on the other. This fascinating blend of cultures is a quirky tidbit that reflects their unique identity as a bridge between the Hellenistic and truly Iranian worlds. They ruled through a decentralized system, relying on powerful noble families and client kings, which gave them flexibility but also led to frequent internal power struggles and civil wars, much like the later Achaemenids. Historians still argue whether the Parthian Empire was a truly Persian empire in the same vein as the Achaemenids, or if it was more of a syncretic, nomadic-derived empire that simply adopted Persian trappings for legitimacy. Despite their strength, the Parthian Empire, like all great powers, faced internal challenges. Succession disputes were common, and ambitious noble families often vied for influence, leading to periods of fragmentation. The ongoing wars with Rome, while often victorious for the Parthians, were costly in terms of manpower and resources. The empire also faced threats from nomadic tribes on its eastern frontiers, requiring constant vigilance. After nearly 5 centuries of rule, a remarkably long lifespan for an ancient empire, the Parthian Empire began to weaken. A major factor was the series of devastating wars with Rome in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE, which severely depleted their resources and manpower. Rome, under emperors like Trajan and Septimius Severus, launched deep incursions into Parthian territory, even sacking their capital city of Ctesiphon multiple times. These relentless Roman campaigns, combined with internal feuding among the Parthian nobility, created a power vacuum and a sense of growing instability. This weakening of central Parthian authority created the perfect opportunity for a new, unifying force to emerge from within Persia itself. The ground was being prepared for a truly indigenous Persian revival, a dynasty that would not only overthrow the Parthians, but also consciously seek to restore the glory and religious purity of the pre-Hellenistic Achaemenid era. The long Parthian interlude was drawing to a close, and a new, fiercely Persian empire was about to burst onto the scene, ready to pick up the mantle of the great kings and confront Rome with renewed vigor. The long, enduring reign of the Parthian Empire, which for centuries had served as a formidable rival to Rome and a bastion of Iranian power, was, as we've seen, slowly crumbling under the weight of internal strife and relentless Roman pressure. But from the ashes of its decline, a new, powerfully resurgent Persian force was about to rise, one that would not only depose the Parthians, but also establish an empire that would consciously hark back to the glory days of the Achaemenids, cementing a distinctly Iranian identity for centuries to come. This was the dawn of the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian dynasty emerged from the province of Persis, modern-day Fars, the very heartland of the ancient Achaemenid Empire. Its founder, Ardashir I, was a local Persian vassal king under the Parthians. He claimed descent from a legendary figure named Sasan, hence Sasanian, and more importantly, from the Achaemenid kings themselves, though this genealogical claim is often debated by historians. Regardless, his lineage gave him immense legitimacy in the eyes of the Persian populace, who yearned for a return to native rule after centuries of foreign, Hellenistic, and Parthian dominion. It was like a long-lost royal family suddenly reappearing to reclaim their rightful throne, generating immense popular support. Ardashir I began his rebellion against the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in the early 3rd century CE. He was a brilliant military leader and a shrewd politician. After a series of decisive victories, culminating in the Battle of Hormizdagan in 224 CE, where Artabanus IV was killed, Ardashir officially founded the Sasanian Empire. He was crowned as Shahanshah, King of Kings, a title deliberately echoing the Achaemenid monarchs. This was more than just a change of dynasty. It was a profound shift, a Neo-Persian revival that emphasized Iranian cultural and religious traditions. The Sasanians were fervent proponents of Zoroastrianism, making it the official state religion and actively promoting its teachings. They saw themselves as the restorers of the faith and its purity, which they believed had been neglected or diluted under the Parthians. A highly organized Zoroastrian priesthood, the Magi, gained immense power and influence during this era, becoming integral to the Sasanian state apparatus. They codified religious texts, established fire temples, and enforced religious orthodoxy. This strong emphasis on a unified state religion was a mainstream historical fact and a major distinguishing feature of Sasanian rule, providing a powerful ideological backbone to the empire. It was like a medieval European kingdom where church and state were inextricably linked, but with ancient Persian characteristics. The Sasanian Empire, at its height, controlled a vast territory stretching from Mesopotamia to parts of Central Asia, and intermittently encompassing parts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and even Egypt. They were formidable warriors, inheriting and refining the equestrian skills of the Parthians, fielding heavily armored cavalry, cataphracts, and clibanarii that were the elite shock troops of their age. Their military might allow them to confront and often defeat their primary rival, the Roman Empire, and later, the Byzantine Empire. The Sasanian-Roman wars were frequent and often devastating, characterized by grand sieges, pitched battles, and the relentless struggle for control of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Levant. This rivalry shaped the geopolitical landscape of the Near East for over 4 centuries. One of the more quirky tidbits from this period is the legend of Bahram Fiv, also known as Bahram Gur, Bahram Wild Ass, who was famed for his hunting prowess and romantic adventures. Stories portray him as a heroic, almost mythical figure, embodying the Sasanian ideal of a king who was both a fearsome warrior and a cultured patron of the arts. His tales are woven into Persian literature, showing a king celebrated for more than just administration and conquest. Historians still argue whether the Sasanians' revival of Achaemenid traditions was a genuine continuity or a politically motivated appropriation of a glorious past to legitimize their rule. It was probably a pragmatic mixture of both, designed to appeal to the deep historical consciousness of their subjects. The Sasanian Empire oversaw a flourishing of Persian art, architecture, and scholarship. They built magnificent palaces, like those at Ctesiphon, Bishapur, and Firuzabad, showcasing a distinct Sasanian style characterized by grand arches, intricate stucco work, and elaborate rock reliefs. They were also centers of intellectual activity, translating and preserving Greek, Indian, and Mesopotamian texts, contributing significantly to fields like medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The city of Gundashapur, for example, became a renowned center of learning and a hospital, a true intellectual hub of the ancient world. Despite their strength and cultural achievements, the Sasanians, like their predecessors, were eventually weakened by internal conflicts, particularly succession disputes and the relentless pressure of constant warfare with the Byzantine Empire. The seemingly endless cycle of wars, though often resulting in Sasanian victories, drained their resources and exhausted their manpower. This left them vulnerable to a new, unforeseen threat emerging from the deserts to the south. The long and glorious chapter of the Sasanian Empire, the last truly independent Great Persian state until modern times, was approaching its end, facing a force that would irrevocably alter the course of Persian history and the entire ancient world. The Sasanian Empire, that last great bastion of independent Persian power and the spiritual heir to the Achaemenids, had, as we've seen, endured for over 4 centuries, standing toe-to-toe with Rome and then Byzantium. But the relentless cycle of warfare, coupled with endemic internal feuds and the occasional outbreak of plague, had slowly but surely hollowed out its immense strength. The once mighty King of Kings now presided over a realm teetering on the brink, unknowingly facing an existential threat from an entirely unexpected quarter. This brings us to the final, transformative chapter in the saga of ancient Persia, the Islamic conquests. From the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, a new, unifying force had emerged in the early 7th century CE, Islam. Inspired by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, the newly unified Arab tribes, fueled by religious fervor and a fierce martial spirit, began to expand outwards with astonishing speed. They had already dealt devastating blows to the Byzantine Empire, conquering much of the Levant. The Sasanian Empire, weakened and exhausted from its protracted wars with Byzantium, the last of which had brought both empires to their knees, was the next, and arguably most important, target. It was a bit like 2 exhausted heavyweight boxers having just gone 15 rounds, suddenly facing a fresh, agile, and incredibly motivated challenger who had just entered the ring. The decisive clashes came swiftly. The Battle of the Bridge in 634 CE saw an early Sasanian victory, but it was a fleeting moment of triumph. The true turning point came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE. This massive engagement, fought near the Euphrates River, pitted the Sasanian army, led by the legendary general Rostam Farrokhzad, against the invading Arab forces. Despite the Sasanians fielding elephants and superior numbers, the disciplined and highly motivated Arab armies, utilizing novel desert tactics, proved ultimately victorious. The death of Rostam and the subsequent collapse of the Sasanian lines were catastrophic. It opened up Mesopotamia, the rich heartland of the Sasanian Empire, to the Arab advance. This was a mainstream historical fact that fundamentally altered the course of Persian history. Following Al-Qadisiyah, the Arab armies moved swiftly, capturing the Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon in 637 CE. The city, with its magnificent Takht Kasra, the Arch of Ctesiphon, and immense wealth, fell, signifying the collapse of central Sasanian authority. The last Sasanian Shahanshah, Yazdgerd III, fled eastward, desperately trying to rally support from the various provincial governors and local magnates. But the unified will that had once characterized the Sasanian state was gone, replaced by fragmentation and self-interest. The final definitive defeat for the Sasanians came at the Battle of Nahavand in 642 CE. This battle, often referred to by Arab historians as the Victory of Victories, sealed the fate of the Sasanian Empire. Yazdgerd III's last major attempt to stem the tide was utterly crushed. After Nahavand, the Sasanian Empire effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Yazdgerd III continued his flight, becoming a hunted fugitive, attempting to raise armies in the eastern provinces. A quirky tidbit from this period is the story of Yazdgerd's desperate flight, culminating in his eventual murder in 651 CE by a local miller near Merv, far to the east, seemingly for his rich robes. A rather inglorious end for the last king of kings of ancient Persia. Historians still argue about the precise reasons for the rapid Sasanian collapse. Was it primarily military exhaustion, internal division, religious intolerance of its Christian subjects, or the overwhelming spiritual and military force of the Arab invaders? It was likely a devastating combination of all these factors, a perfect storm that overwhelmed an already weakened giant. The conquest of Persia by the Arab Islamic armies was not just a change of rulers, it was a profound transformation. Zoroastrianism, though it continued to exist, gradually declined as Islam became the dominant religion. The Arabic language slowly began to permeate Persian society, becoming the language of administration and scholarship, though Persian eventually re-emerged as a distinct literary language. The social and political structures of the empire were fundamentally altered, replaced by the nascent Islamic Caliphate. The fall of the Sasanian Empire marked the end of the long and glorious era of ancient Persia. For over 12 centuries, since the rise of Cyrus the Great, various Persian empires had shaped the course of world history, leaving an indelible legacy in administration, art, architecture, and religious thought. From the Achaemenids to the Parthians to the Sasanians, they built magnificent cities, forged vast empires, and engaged in epic conflicts with their neighbors. Their influence on law, governance, and culture resonated far beyond their borders. The land itself, however, would endure. While politically and religiously transformed, the vibrant culture, artistic genius, and intellectual prowess of the Persian people would continue, blending with the new Islamic identity to produce a uniquely rich and influential civilization in the centuries to come. But the age of the great kings, the independent Zoroastrian-led empires of ancient Persia, had finally drawn to a quiet, if rather violent, close.